The chains bit deep into her wrists as Helen White pressed herself against the rotting barn wall, her breath forming small clouds in the frigid mountain air. Through the gaps in the weathered boards, she could see him approaching through the snow, his massive frame cutting a dark silhouette against the white landscape. Jeremy Walker moved with the quiet confidence of a man who belonged to these mountains, his boots crunching softly on the frozen ground. In his hand, a kehenam, he carried bolt cutters that gleamed dully in the pale winter light. Helen's heart hammered against her ribs as she watched this stranger who had found her in her darkest hour. 3 days she had been chained here like an animal. 3 days of Carl Evans telling her she belonged to him now, that she would work his land until she died or paid off debts that weren't even hers. 3 days of believing no one would ever find her in this remote corner of the Colorado Rockies, where the nearest neighbor was 20 miles away, and the law was whatever a man with enough guns said it was. But Jeremy Walker had found her. The mountain man who lived alone in a cabin carved from the very stone of these peaks had heard her cries carried on the wind, had tracked them to their source like a wolf following a scent. Now he stood before the barn door, his dark eyes meeting hers through the slats, and she saw something in them that made her breath catch. Not pity, not the cold calculation she had grown accustomed to in Carl's gaze, but a quiet fury that burned like banked coals. The barn door creaked as Jeremy pushed it open, the sound echoing in the cavernous space. Shafts of winter sunlight slanted through the opening, illuminating dust motes that danced like spirits in the air. Helen shrank back instinctively, even though every fiber of her being knew this man had not come to harm her. He was tall, perhaps 6.5 feet, with shoulders broad enough to fill a doorway, and hands that looked capable of crushing stone. His dark hair was longer than fashion dictated, touching his collar, and a beard covered the lower half of his face. But it was his eyes that held her attention, gray as storm clouds and just as unpredictable. Before we see how this ends, tell us where you're watching from and hype this video in the comments. Jeremy's voice, when he finally spoke, was rougher than she had expected, weathered by years of solitude and mountain winds. "Ma'am," he said simply, inclining his head in a gesture that somehow managed to convey both respect and reassurance. "I'm going to get you out of those chains." Helen tried to speak but found her voice had abandoned her. She had screamed herself hoarse those first 2 days, calling for help that never came until Carl had grown tired of the noise and threatened to cut out her tongue if she made another sound. Now, faced with this unexpected salvation, she could only nod and watch as Jeremy approached with careful, measured steps. He knelt beside her, and she caught his scent, clean pine and wood smoke and something essentially masculine that made her pulse quicken despite her circumstances. His hands were gentle as he examined the chains that bound her wrists to the barn wall, though she could see the muscle in his jaw jumping as he took in the raw, bloody marks the metal had left on her skin. "Bastard," Jeremy muttered under his breath, the word carrying the weight of a death sentence. He positioned the bolt cutters around the first chain link, his movements precise and controlled. "This is going to make some noise," he warned her, "but I need you to stay still." The sound of metal shearing echoed through the barn like a gunshot. Helen flinched but held herself motionless as Jeremy worked methodically through each link. When the last chain fell away, with a metallic clatter, she brought her hands to her chest, hardly daring to believe she was free. Jeremy stood and stepped back, giving her space to move, to breathe, to remember what it felt like to be human again. "Can you walk?" he asked. Helen tested her legs, surprised to find them steady despite the ordeal. "I think so," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Good. We need to get you away from here before Carl comes back." Jeremy's eyes swept the barn, taking in the makeshift prison Carl had created. A bucket for water, another for waste, a thin blanket thrown in one corner. His expression darkened further. "How long has he had you here?" 3 days, Helen managed. "He said I belonged to him now, said I had to work off my father's debts." Jeremy's hands clenched into fists at his sides. "Your father's debts?" "Papa borrowed money from Carl last winter when the crops failed. When he died of the fever 2 months ago, Carl said the debt passed to me." Helen wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly aware of how thin her dress had become, how inadequate it was against the mountain cold. "He said I could work his land as payment, but then he brought me here and chained me up like an animal." The silence stretched between them, filled only by the whisper of wind through the barn walls. Jeremy studied her face, taking in the bruises that Carl's fist had left, the hollow look of someone who had given up hope and found it again in the space of minutes. When he spoke again, his voice held a quality she couldn't quite identify, something that made her look up and meet his eyes. "You don't belong to anyone," he said quietly. "Not to Carl Evans, not to any man. You understand me?" Helen nodded, though part of her wondered if she truly believed it. She had been property for so long, first her father's responsibility and then Carl's prisoner, that the concept of belonging to herself felt foreign and frightening. Jeremy seemed to read her thoughts. "We'll figure the rest out later. Right now, we need to move." He shrugged out of his heavy coat and wrapped it around her shoulders. The garment was enormous on her slight frame, but it carried his warmth and that clean mountain scent that somehow made her feel safer than she had in months. They moved through the barn door together, Helen's legs shaky but determined. The Colorado wilderness spread before them in all directions, a vast expanse of snow-covered peaks and valleys that could hide a person forever or swallow them whole. Jeremy's cabin was visible in the distance, a dark speck against the white mountainside, smoke rising from its chimney in a thin gray line. "It's not much," Jeremy said, following her gaze. "But it's warm, and it's safe. Carl Evans won't find you there." As they walked through the snow, Helen found herself studying her rescuer from the corner of her eye. Jeremy Walker was a legend in these parts, the mountain man who had appeared 5 years ago and carved out a life in the wilderness that most men couldn't survive. Some said he was running from something, others that he was just too wild for civilization. Watching him now, the way he moved through the landscape like he was part of it, Helen thought both stories might be true. The snow crunched under their feet as they climbed the winding path to Jeremy's cabin. Helen's breath came in short puffs, her body weak from days of captivity and poor food. Jeremy noticed her struggle and slowed his pace without comment, his presence beside her steady and reassuring. The cabin, when they reached it, was larger than it had appeared from a distance. Built from logs and stone, it seemed to grow out of the mountainside itself as if it had always been there. Smoke rose from the stone chimney, and warm yellow light glowed in the windows. It looked like something from a fairy tale, a place where lost souls might find refuge. Jeremy pushed open the heavy wooden door and gestured for her to enter first. The interior was simple but comfortable, dominated by a large stone fireplace where logs crackled and sparked. Handmade furniture filled the space, sturdy pieces that spoke of careful craftsmanship in endless winter evenings. Books lined shelves along one wall, more books than Helen had ever seen in one place. The air smelled of wood smoke and coffee and something cooking in a pot over the fire. "Sit," Jeremy said, guiding her to a chair near the fireplace. "You need food and rest." Helen sank into the chair gratefully, Jeremy's coat still wrapped around her shoulders. The warmth from the fire seemed to seep into her bones, chasing away the chill that had settled there during her captivity. She watched as Jeremy moved around the cabin with easy familiarity, ladling stew from the pot into a wooden bowl, pouring coffee from a battered pot that sat at the edge of the coals. When he handed her the bowl, their fingers brushed briefly, and Helen felt a shock of awareness that had nothing to do with the cold. Jeremy's hands were scarred and calloused from hard work, but his touch was gentle, careful. She wondered what had brought him to this lonely place, what had made him choose solitude over the company of others. The stew was simple but delicious. Rabbit and vegetables, herbs that Jeremy must have grown himself. Helen ate slowly, savoring each bite, hardly able to believe that just an hour ago she had been chained in Carl's barn with nothing but stale bread and dirty water. Jeremy settled into the chair across from her, his own bowl in his hands. For a while they ate in comfortable silence, the only sounds the crackling of the fire and the whisper of wind around the cabin walls. Helen found herself relaxing for the first time in days, her body finally beginning to believe that she was safe. "Tell me about your father," Jeremy said eventually. Helen set down her spoon and stared into the fire. "He was a good man," she said quietly, "a farmer like his father before him. We had a small place about 10 miles from here, nothing fancy, but it was home. When the crops failed last winter, he was desperate. Mama had died the year before, and it was just the two of us trying to make it work. So he went to Carl for money. Carl was the only one who would lend to us. The bank in town wouldn't touch Papa after the failed harvest. Carl said he understood hard times, said he'd help us get back on our feet. Helen's voice turned bitter. He helped us, all right. Helped himself to our land when Papa couldn't pay, and then helped himself to me when Papa died. Jeremy's jaw tightened, but his voice remained calm. What kind of debt are we talking about? $200. Might as well be $2,000 for all the chance I had of paying it back. Helen pulled Jeremy's coat tighter around herself. Carl said I could work it off, but the way he looked at me, the things he said, I knew what kind of work he had in mind. The fire popped and hissed, sending sparks up the chimney. Jeremy stared into the flames, his expression unreadable. When he spoke again, his voice was so quiet Helen had to strain to hear it. $200, he repeated. I know it doesn't sound like much to some folks, but it's nothing, Jeremy cut her off. Less than nothing. A man's life, a woman's freedom, that's worth more than all the money in the world. Helen studied his face in the firelight, trying to read the emotions that flickered across his features like shadows. There was anger there, yes, but something else too. Something that looked almost like pain. You don't know me, she said softly. Why would you help a stranger? Jeremy was quiet for a long moment, his gray eyes fixed on the fire. When he finally looked at her, Helen saw depths there that she hadn't expected. Layers of experience and loss that spoke of a man who had lived through his own darkness. Maybe because I know what it's like to be trapped, he said simply. Maybe because I know what it's like when the whole world seems set against you and there's nowhere to turn. Is that why you came to the mountains? To get away from something? Jeremy smiled. He was bitter. Among other things. He stood and moved to the window, looking out at the snow-covered landscape. I had a different life once. A wife, a home in town, plans for the future. But sometimes the world has other ideas about how your story should go. Helen waited, sensing there was more he wanted to say. The silence stretched between them, comfortable despite the weight of unspoken history. She died, Jeremy said finally. Sarah. Fever took her 3 winters ago, same fever that probably took your father. I couldn't save her, couldn't do anything but watch her slip away. After that, the town, the memories, it all felt like a trap. So I came here. I'm sorry, Helen whispered. Jeremy turned from the window, his expression softer now. Point is, I know what it's like to lose everything, to feel like you're drowning and nobody cares enough to throw you a rope. When I heard you calling from that barn, I heard myself 3 years ago. The intimacy of his confession hung between them like a bridge, connecting their separate sorrows. Helen felt something shift inside her chest, a loosening of the tight knot of fear and despair that had lived there for so long. What happens now? She asked. Jeremy returned to his chair, his movements deliberate and controlled. Now you rest. Tomorrow we figure out how to deal with Carl Evans. He'll come looking for me. He won't just let me go. I'm counting on it. Jeremy's voice held a note that made Helen shiver, not from cold, but from the promise of violence barely held in check. Carl Evans has been terrorizing folks in these mountains for too long. Maybe it's time someone reminded him that there are still men willing to stand up to bullies. Helen felt a flutter of fear, not for herself, but for this man who had risked everything to save her. He's dangerous, Jeremy. He has men who work for him, men with guns. So do I. Jeremy's smile was grim. The difference is I know these mountains better than any man alive, and I don't have anything left to lose. The night deepened around the cabin, and Jeremy showed Helen to a small room at the back of the house. It was simple but clean, with a narrow bed covered in handmade quilts and a window that looked out on the star-filled sea. He left her with fresh clothes that had belonged to his wife, garments that smelled of lavender and cedar and carried the ghost of another woman's dreams. Helen changed slowly, her body stiff and sore from her ordeal. The clothes fit reasonably well, though they were a bit loose in the chest and short in the sleeves. She caught sight of herself in the small mirror above the washstand and barely recognized the woman staring back. Her dark hair was tangled and dirty, her face marked by bruises and exhaustion. But there was something else there too, something that hadn't been there before. A spark of defiance, of hope, that Carl Evans hadn't been able to crush. She lay down on the bed and pulled the quilts up to her chin, listening to the sounds of Jeremy moving around the main room. She could hear him banking the fire, checking the locks on the doors and windows, preparing for whatever morning might bring. The sounds were comforting, the domestic rituals of a man making his home secure. Sleep should have come easily after days of exhaustion, but Helen found herself staring at the ceiling, her mind racing. Everything had changed so quickly that she could barely process it. This morning she had been Carl's prisoner, resigned to a fate worse than death. Now she lay in a warm bed, safe under the protection of a man who had asked for nothing in return except the chance to do what was right. But what would tomorrow bring? Carl would discover her absence soon enough, and his rage would be terrible. He was not a man who accepted defeat gracefully, and he had too much invested in his control over the local farmers to let Helen's escape go unanswered. He would come for her, and when he did, Jeremy Walker would stand between them. The thought terrified her, not because she doubted Jeremy's courage, but because she couldn't bear the idea of being responsible for another person's suffering. She had seen enough violence, enough death, to last several lifetimes. The idea that Jeremy might be hurt or killed because of her made her stomach clench with guilt and fear. But beneath the fear was something else, something that surprised her with its intensity. She cared about Jeremy Walker, the strange, solitary man who had appeared in her darkest hour like an answer to prayers she hadn't dared to pray. In the space of a single evening, he had shown her more kindness and respect than she had received in months of captivity. He had looked at her not as property to be owned or used, but as a human being deserving of dignity and freedom. Dawn came gray and cold, filtering through the cabin windows like smoke. Helen woke to the sound of Jeremy moving around the kitchen, the familiar domestic sounds of coffee brewing and bacon sizzling in a pan. For a moment, she lay still and listened, pretending that this was her life, that she belonged in this warm sanctuary carved from the mountainside. But reality intruded quickly enough. Today, Carl would discover her escape, and the fragile peace of this place would be shattered. Helen rose and dressed quickly, braiding her hair back with fingers that trembled only slightly. When she emerged from the bedroom, she found Jeremy standing at the stove, his back to her. He had already dressed for the day in wool pants and a flannel shirt, and she could see the outline of a gun belt around his waist. "Morning," he said without turning around. "Coffee's ready." Helen poured herself a cup from the pot on the stove, inhaling the rich aroma. Jeremy's coffee was strong and black, the kind that could wake the dead or keep a man alert through a long night watch. "You didn't sleep much," she observed, noting the lines of fatigue round his eyes. "Neither did you." Jeremy turned from the stove, a plate of eggs and bacon in his hands. "Eat. You'll need your strength today." They ate in silence, both lost in their own thoughts. Through the windows, Helen could see the morning mist rising from the valleys below, the peaks catching the first rays of sunlight like crown jewels. It was beautiful and peaceful, a landscape that seemed to exist outside of time and human conflict. "I've been thinking," Helen said finally, "maybe I should just leave. Go somewhere far from here, start over where Carl can't find me." Jeremy's fork paused halfway to his mouth. "Running away won't solve anything. Carl will just find some other woman to terrorize, some other family to destroy. Men like him don't stop until someone makes them stop. But if I'm not here, if you're not here, you'll spend the rest of your life looking over your shoulder, wondering when he'll catch up to you." Jeremy set down his fork and leaned forward, his gray eyes intense. "Is that the kind of life you want?" Helen stared down at her plate, her appetite gone. "I don't know what kind of life I want. I've never been free to choose before." The admission hung between them, raw and honest. Jeremy reached across the table and covered her hand with his, the contact warm and reassuring. "Then maybe it's time you learned," he said quietly. Before Helen could respond, the sound of horses approaching cut through the morning air. Jeremy was on his feet instantly, his hand moving to the gun at his hip. He moved to the window and peered through the curtains, his body tense and ready. "How many?" Helen whispered, her heart hammering against her ribs. "3. Carl and 2 of his men." Jeremy's voice was calm, but Helen could see the muscle jumping in his jaw. "Stay back from the windows." The horses stopped outside the cabin, and Helen heard Carl's voice, loud and arrogant in the morning stillness. "Walker, I know you're in there, and I know you've got something that belongs to me." Jeremy moved away from the window, his hand resting on the butt of his gun. You've got no business here, Evans, he called back. Move along. The hell I don't. That girl owes me money and I mean to collect. Send her out and we can settle this like civilized men. Jeremy's laugh was harsh. Civilized? Is that what you call chaining a woman in a barn like an animal? She's a debtor, Walker. The law's on my side. The law? Jeremy shook his head. You wouldn't know the law if it bit you on the ass, Evans. The girl's father is dead, which means his debts died with him. You've got no legal claim on her. There was a moment of silence from outside, then Carl's voice again, angrier now. Legal or not, she's coming with me. I've got too much invested in that piece of land to let some mountain hermit interfere with my business. Helen moved to Jeremy's side, her fear transformed into something harder and more determined. Let me talk. To him, she said quietly. Absolutely not. Jeremy, please, this is my fight too. Jeremy studied her face, seeing something there that made him nod slowly. Stay behind me, he said, and if shooting starts, you hit the floor and stay there. They moved to the door together, Jeremy's hand on the latch. When he opened it, Helen could see Carl Evans sitting his horse in the yard, flanked by two men she recognized from town. Carl was a big man, soft around the middle, but still dangerous, with small eyes that missed nothing and a mouth that seemed permanently twisted in a sneer. There she is, Carl said, his gaze fixing on Helen with an intensity that made her skin crawl. Come along, girl. Time to go back where you belong. Helen stepped forward, Jeremy's presence solid and reassuring beside her. I don't belong anywhere, she said, surprised by the strength in her own voice. And I don't owe you anything. My father's debts died with him. Carl's face darkened. Your father signed papers, girl. Legal papers that say otherwise. Papers you forged, Jeremy said quietly. I've seen your work before, Evans. You're not as clever as you think you are. The accusation hit its mark. Carl's hand moved toward the gun on his hip, but Jeremy was faster, his own weapon appearing in his hand like magic. The two men flanking Carl tensed, but neither made a move to draw their guns. Careful, Evans, Jeremy said, his voice deadly calm. You're outnumbered. Carl looked around the clearing, confusion flickering across his face. Outnumbered? I count 3 of us and 2 of you. Jeremy's smile was cold. Tomban. Look again. As if summoned by his words, figures emerged from the tree line around the cabin. Mountain men, trappers, and homesteaders who had been quietly moving into position while Carl made his demands. Helen counted at least 6 men, all armed, all with expressions that suggested they had personal reasons for disliking Carl Evans. You see, Evans, Jeremy continued, you've been making enemies up here for a long time. Folks are tired of your bullying, tired of watching you steal land and terrorize women. Today seemed like a good day to do something about it. Carl's face had gone pale, but his voice remained defiant. This is kidnapping, Walker. I'll have the law on you. The law? One of the mountain men spoke up, a grizzled veteran named Mark Ruiz, who had lost his own farm to Carl's schemes. The law is what we make it up here, Evans, and we say the girl goes free. The standoff stretched taut as a bowstring, the morning air thick with the promise of violence. Helen could feel the tension radiating from every man present, could see the calculations running behind their eyes as they weighed the cost of conflict against the satisfaction of justice. Carl Evans was many things, but he was not stupid. His gaze swept the circle of armed men, taking in their positions, their weapons, their obvious determination. He was outnumbered and outgunned, and everyone present knew it. This isn't over, Walker, Carl said finally, his voice thick with rage and frustration. The girl still owes me money, and I mean to collect. The only thing that girl owes you is a bullet, Jeremy replied quietly. And if you come near her again, she won't be the one to deliver it. Carl jerked his horse's reins, wheeling the animal around. His 2 companions followed suit, clearly relieved to be leaving without bloodshed. As they rode away, Carl turned in his saddle for one last parting shot. Enjoy your mountain horror, Walker, but don't get too comfortable. I'll be back. The insult hit Helen like a physical blow, but before she could react, Jeremy had moved. His rifle appeared in his hands as if by magic, the barrel tracking Carl's retreating form. For a moment, Helen thought he would pull the trigger, would end the threat once and for all. But Jeremy lowered the weapon, his jaw tight with controlled fury. "Let him go," he said quietly. "For now." The mountain men began to disperse, melting back into the forest as quietly as they had appeared. Mark Ruiz lingered for a moment, his weathered face creased with concern. "You know he'll be back," Mark said. "Carl Evans doesn't give up easy." "I'm counting on it," Jeremy replied. "Next time, maybe we can settle this permanent-like." Mark nodded and disappeared into the trees, leaving Jeremy and Helen alone in the clearing. The morning sun had climbed higher, burning off the mist and revealing the full beauty of the mountain landscape. Birds sang in the trees, and a gentle breeze stirred the pine boughs, as if nature itself was celebrating their small victory. But Helen felt no celebration in her heart, only a deep weariness and the knowledge that this was far from over. Carl Evans was a man who held grudges, who never forgot a slight or forgave an enemy. He would be back, and next time he would come prepared for war. "I'm sorry," she said quietly, "about what he called me." Jeremy turned to look at her, his gray eyes soft with understanding. "Don't apologize for his ignorance. Carl Evans is a small man with a smaller mind. His words can't touch you unless you let them." They walked back to the cabin together, the morning's confrontation already taking on the quality of a half-remembered dream. Inside, Jeremy busied himself cleaning his rifle while Helen tried to process what had just happened. 6 men had risked their lives to defend her, a woman they barely knew, simply because it was the right thing to do. "Why did they come?" she asked. "Those men, I mean. They don't even know me." Jeremy looked up from his weapon, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "They know Carl Evans, and that's enough. Every man out there has lost something to him, land or family or dignity. They came because they're tired of being afraid, tired of watching him destroy everything decent in these mountains. And you organized it. I sent word yesterday while you were sleeping, asked a few friends if they'd like to help settle an old score." Jeremy's expression grew serious. "But this is just the beginning, Helen. Carl won't give up, and next time he'll come with more men and bigger guns." Helen sank into the chair by the fireplace, suddenly exhausted despite the early hour. "Maybe I should have gone with him. Maybe it would have been easier." "Easier for who?" Jeremy set down his rifle and moved to kneel beside her chair. "Helen, look at me." She raised her eyes to meet his, seeing compassion there mixed with something fiercer, more protective. "You are not responsible for Carl Evans's actions," Jeremy said firmly. "You are not responsible for his greed or his cruelty or his need to control others. The only thing you're responsible for is deciding what kind of life you want to live. I don't know how to make that decision. I've never been allowed to choose anything for myself." Jeremy was quiet for a moment, his gray eyes thoughtful. When he spoke again, his voice held a quality that made Helen's heart skip. "Then maybe it's time you learned. Stay here, Helen, not as my prisoner or my debt, but as my partner. Help me build something good in this place, something that Carl Evans and men like him can't touch." The offer hung between them like a bridge across a chasm, beautiful and terrifying in its implications. Helen stared at Jeremy's face, searching for any sign of deception or ulterior motive. But all she saw was honesty, a man offering her something she had never dared to dream of, true freedom. "You don't know me," she whispered. "I could be anyone, anything." "I know enough," Jeremy replied. "I know you're strong enough to survive 3 days in Carl's barn without breaking. I know you're brave enough to stand up to him this morning instead of hiding behind me. I know you're kind enough to worry about my safety when you should be thinking about your own." Tears pricked at Helen's eyes, but they were not tears of sadness. For the first time in her adult life, someone was seeing her as she truly was, not as property to be owned or a burden to be endured, but as a person worthy of respect and partnership. "What are you asking me?" she said softly. Jeremy's smile was gentle, transforming his weathered features. "I'm asking you to marry me, Helen White. Not because you owe me anything or because you have nowhere else to go, but because I think we could build something beautiful together. Something worth fighting for." The proposal hung in the air between them like morning mist, beautiful and insubstantial, too precious to grasp too quickly. Helen stared at Jeremy's face, searching for any sign that this was some elaborate jest or cruel trick. But his gray eyes held only sincerity, and the gentle curve of his mouth spoke of a man who had considered his words carefully before speaking them. Marriage, Helen repeated, the word feeling foreign on her tongue. You want to, marry me. I want to offer you a choice, Jeremy corrected gently. The choice to be your own woman, to make your own decisions about your life and your future. If you choose to share that future with me, then yes, I'd be honored to call you my wife. Helen rose from her chair and walked to the window, looking out at the mountain landscape that had become her sanctuary. The peaks stretched endlessly in all directions, their snow-covered summits catching the morning light like jewels. It was a harsh land, unforgiving to the weak or unprepared, but it was also free in a way that the settled valleys below could never be. I don't love you, she said quietly, not turning from the window. I barely know you. I know. Jeremy's voice held no hurt, no disappointment, only understanding. Love isn't something that can be forced or demanded. It has to grow naturally, like the trees on these mountains. All I'm asking for is the chance to plant the seed. Helen turned to face him, her dark eyes serious. And if it never grows, if I can never be more to you than a partner, a friend? Jeremy's smile was sad but genuine. Then I'll have the friendship of a remarkable woman, and that's more than many men can claim. Helen, I'm not asking you to love me. I'm asking you to give yourself the chance to discover what love might be, without fear or obligation clouding your judgment. The honesty in his words cut through Helen's defenses like a knife through silk. She had spent so long being told what to feel, what to want, what to be, that the idea of discovering these things for herself seemed both thrilling and terrifying. Carl will never stop hunting me, she said. As long as I'm alive, he'll see me as his property. Is that the kind of trouble you want to bring into your life? Carl Evans is my problem now, not yours, Jeremy replied firmly. I've been avoiding a reckoning with him for too long. Maybe it's time I stopped running from fights that need fighting. Helen studied his face, seeing the resolve there, the quiet determination that had carried him through years of solitude and loss. Jeremy Walker was not a man who made promises lightly, and she found herself believing that he would indeed stand between her and Carl Evans, no matter the cost. She asked, why are you willing to risk everything for a woman you've known for less than a day? Jeremy was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the fire crackling in the hearth. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of memory and loss. Because I know what it's like to be helpless, he said finally. To watch someone you care about suffer and not be able to do anything about it. When my wife was dying, I would have given anything, done anything to save her. But there was nothing I could do except hold her hand and watch her fade away. He looked up at Helen, his gray eyes bright with unshed tears. Yesterday, when I heard you calling from that barn, I heard Sarah's voice. I heard every woman who's ever been trapped, ever been hurt, ever been told she was worthless. And I realized that maybe God was giving me a chance to do what I couldn't do before, to save someone. The raw honesty of his confession left Helen breathless. She saw him clearly now, this mountain man who had seemed so strong and self-sufficient. He was as broken as she was, as lost and searching for meaning in a world that had dealt them both cruel hands. I'm not your wife, she said softly. I can't replace what you lost. I don't want you to replace her, Jeremy replied. I want you to be yourself, Helen White. I want you to discover who that person is when she's free to choose her own path. Helen walked to the fireplace, holding her hands out to the warmth. The flames danced and flickered, hypnotic in their constant motion, and she found herself thinking of her father, of the choices he had made that led to this moment. He had been a good man, but he had also been a man of his time, unable to see his daughter as anything more than a responsibility to be managed and eventually passed on to another man. If I say yes, she said slowly, what would that mean? What kind of marriage are you proposing? Jeremy joined her by the fire, his presence warm and reassuring. It would mean whatever we decide it means. We could have a partnership, a friendship that might grow into something more. Or we could have a marriage in name only, a legal protection that gives you the right to make your own choices. And if I wanted more, if I wanted a real marriage, children, A family? Jeremy's smile was gentle. Then we'd take it one day at a time and see where it leads us. The simplicity of his answer appealed to Helen more than any grand romantic gesture could have. Here was a man offering her something she had never had, the freedom to choose her own destiny, to discover her own heart without pressure or expectation. "There's something you should know about me," she said quietly. "Something that might change your mind." Jeremy waited, his expression patient and accepting. "I've never been with a man," Helen continued, her cheeks burning with embarrassment. "Never been kissed, never been courted properly. Carl was going to be the first, and the thought of it made me sick. I don't know if I can ever be a proper wife to anyone." Jeremy's expression softened with understanding. "Helen, there's no such thing as a proper wife, just as there's no such thing as a proper husband. There are only two people trying to build a life together, learning as they go." He reached out and gently took her hand. "Whatever happened or didn't happen in your past doesn't define your future. That's up to you now." The touch of his hand sent warmth spreading up Helen's arm, a sensation both foreign and welcome. She had expected calluses and roughness, but Jeremy's skin was surprisingly gentle, his fingers long and elegant despite the obvious strength in them. "I'm scared," she admitted, the words barely above a whisper. "Of me?" Helen shook her head. "Of myself, of making the wrong choice, of disappointing you." Jeremy's thumb brushed across her knuckles, a gesture so tender it made her throat tighten with emotion. "The only way you could disappoint me is by making a choice based on fear instead of hope. Whatever you decide, it has to be what you want, not what you think I want to hear." Helen looked into his gray eyes, seeing patience there, and kindness, and something deeper that she was only beginning to recognize. This man had risked his life to save her, had offered her protection and partnership without asking for anything in return. He had shown her more respect in a single day than she had received in her entire life. "Yes," she said quietly. Jeremy's eyebrows rose. "Yes? Yes, I'll marry you." Helen's voice grew stronger as she spoke. "Not because I have to, not because I owe you anything, but because I want to, because I want to discover who I am when I'm free to choose." Jeremy's smile was radiant, transforming his entire face. "Are you sure?" "I'm terrified," Helen said honestly, "but I'm also more sure than I've ever been about anything in my life." Jeremy lifted her hand to his lips and pressed a gentle kiss to her knuckles, a gesture that spoke of reverence and promise. "Then we'll figure it out together." The sound of approaching horses interrupted the moment, and Jeremy's expression immediately shifted to alertness. He moved to the window, his hand automatically going to his gun. "More trouble?" Helen asked, her heart sinking. "No," Jeremy said, relief evident in his voice. "It's Ryan Baker. He's the circuit preacher for these parts." Helen joined him at the window and saw a thin man in a black coat riding up the path, his horse picking its way carefully through the snow. Behind him rode another man, older and more weathered, whom Helen recognized as Tyler Cox, one of the mountain men who had stood with them against Carl that morning. Jeremy opened the door as the two men approached. "Ryan, Taylor, this is unexpected." Ryan Baker dismounted and approached the cabin, his weathered face creased with concern. "Heard there was some trouble this morning. Tyler here thought you might be in need of my services." Jeremy glanced at Helen, a question in his eyes. She nodded almost imperceptibly, and he smiled. "As a matter of fact, preacher, your timing couldn't be better. Miss Helen White and I are in need of a wedding." Ryan's eyebrows shot up. "A wedding? Well, I'll be. And here I thought I was coming to perform last rites." Tyler Cox chuckled as he dismounted. "Might still come to that if Carl Evans has anything to say about it. But I figure you two might want to make it legal before the shooting starts." Helen felt her cheeks burn at the implication, but Jeremy's hand found hers, steady and reassuring. "Helen," Jeremy said quietly, "are you ready for this?" She looked around at the three men, all watching her with varying degrees of curiosity and concern. A day ago, she had been a prisoner, chained in a barn with no hope of escape. Now she stood on the threshold of a new life, surrounded by men who respected her right to choose her own destiny. "I'm ready," she said firmly. Ryan Baker smiled and reached into his saddlebags, pulling out a worn leather Bible. "Well then, let's get you two properly hitched before Carl Evans decides to pay another visit." The wedding ceremony was simple but profound, conducted in the main room of Jeremy's cabin with Tyler Cox serving as witness. Helen had no flowers, no white dress, no family to give her away. But as she stood beside Jeremy and listened to Ryan Baker's words about love and commitment and choosing to build a life together, she felt more beautiful and cherished than any bride in the finest church. When Jeremy slipped a simple gold band onto her finger, a ring that had belonged to his grandmother, Helen felt something shift inside her chest. It wasn't love, not yet, but it was the beginning of something precious. The first green shoot of trust and affection pushing through the frozen ground of her heart. "You may kiss the bride," Ryan announced with a grin. Jeremy looked at Helen, his eyes asking permission. She nodded, suddenly nervous but also curious about this ritual that would seal their union. Jeremy's kiss was gentle and brief, a soft brush of lips that spoke of respect and promise rather than passion. But even that chaste contact sent warmth flooding through Helen's body, a preview of intimacies yet to be discovered. "Well," Tyler said as they broke apart, "that's the prettiest wedding I've seen in years, and the quickest." Ryan closed his Bible and tucked it away. "I'll file the papers in town, make it all legal and proper, though I suspect Carl Evans won't be too happy when he hears about it." "Carl Evans can go to hell," Jeremy said mildly, his arm around Helen's waist. "He's got no claim on my wife." My wife. The words sent a thrill through the Helen that she hadn't expected. She was married now, legally and morally bound to this man who had saved her life and offered her freedom. It was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. After Ryan and Tyler left, promising to spread word of the marriage throughout the mountain community, Helen found herself alone with her new husband. The cabin seemed different somehow, charged with new possibilities and unspoken questions. "So," Jeremy said, his voice carefully casual, "how does it feel to be Mrs. Walker?" Helen considered the question, testing the weight of her new identity. "Strange," she said honestly, "but good strange. Like putting on clothes that actually fit for the first time in your life." Jeremy's smile was warm and understanding. "It'll take some getting used to, for both of us." "Jeremy," Helen said hesitantly, "about tonight." "Tonight you sleep in the guest room, same as last night," Jeremy Thun said firmly. "This marriage is whatever we make it, Helen. There's no rush, no expectations. We have all the time in the world to figure out what we want from each other." Relief flooded through Helen so powerfully that her knees nearly buckled. She had been dreading this moment, fearing that marriage would mean an immediate end to her newfound autonomy, that Jeremy would expect to claim his husbandly rights regardless of her feelings. "Thank you," she whispered. "For what?" "For giving me time, for not expecting more than I'm ready to give." Jeremy's expression grew serious. "Helen, I need you to understand something. What we have, this marriage, it's not about what I can take from you. It's about what we can build together. That means both of us have to be willing participants, not just in the legal sense, but in every way that matters." The afternoon passed quietly, with Helen helping Jeremy with the daily tasks that kept the cabin running. She learned that he grew much of his own food in a garden carved from the mountainside, that he hunted and trapped to supplement their diet, that he had built most of the furniture in the cabin with his own hands. It was a self-sufficient life, demanding but satisfying in ways that her father's struggling farm had never been. As evening approached, Jeremy began preparing dinner, moving around the kitchen with the easy confidence of a man accustomed to caring for himself. Helen watched him work, noting the careful way he seasoned the venison stew, the precise manner in which he sliced the bread he had baked that morning. There was an artistry to his domestic skills that spoke of long practice and genuine care. "You're a good cook," Helen observed, accepting the bowl he offered her. "Had to learn," Jeremy replied with a shrug. "It was either that or starve." They ate by the fire, the flames casting dancing shadows on the log walls. Outside, the wind had picked up, whistling through the trees and rattling the windows. It was the kind of night that made a person grateful for shelter and warmth, for the simple comfort of another human presence. "Tell me about your life before," Helen said, "before you came to the mountains." Jeremy was quiet for a moment, his spoon pausing halfway to his mouth. "I was a carpenter in Denver, had a small shop, did custom work for folks who could afford it. Sarah and I lived in a little house on the edge of town. Nothing fancy, but it was ours." "What was she like?" "Sarah?" Jeremy's smile was soft with memory. She was light where I'm darkness, always seeing the best in people, even when they didn't deserve it. She could make friends with a rattlesnake if she put her mind to it. His expression grew sad. She wanted children, a house full of them. We tried for 3 years, but it never happened. Then the fever came and suddenly it didn't matter anymore. Helen felt a pang of sympathy for this woman she had never met, this ghost who still lived in Jeremy's heart. Duh, you still love her? Jeremy met her eyes across the table, his gaze steady and honest. I'll always love Sarah. She was my first love, my young love, and that kind of feeling doesn't just disappear. But she's gone, and I'm still here, still living. I've learned that the heart is bigger than we think, that it can hold more than one kind of love. What do you mean? I mean that loving Sarah doesn't make me incapable of loving someone else. It just makes me different than I was before, more careful maybe, more aware of how precious and fragile happiness can be. Helen considered his words, feeling something loosen in her chest. She had been afraid that she would always be competing with a memory, always falling short of a woman she could never be. But Jeremy was offering her something different, the possibility of a love that was entirely her own. I don't know how to be a wife, she admitted. I don't know how to cook like you do, or keep house properly, or any of the things women are supposed to know. Then we'll learn together, Jeremy said simply. Helen, there's no rule book for marriage, no right or wrong way to build a life with someone. We'll make it up as we go along. The evening deepened, and they sat by the fire talking about small things, safe things. Helen learned that Jeremy had taught himself to read by lamplight after long days in the carpenter shop, that he had built the cabin over the course of 2 summers, working alone except for the occasional help of passing travelers. She told him about her childhood, about helping her father with the farm work, about her mother's garden, and the songs she used to sing while she worked. It was the kind of conversation that married couples might have, the slow exchange of histories and dreams that builds intimacy one word at a time. Helen found herself relaxing in ways she hadn't thought possible, her guard dropping as Jeremy's quiet acceptance worked its way past her defenses. When it came time to retire for the night, Jeremy banked the fire and checked the locks on the doors and windows. It was a ritual Helen was beginning to recognize, the careful preparations of a man who understood that safety was never guaranteed, especially in these wild mountains where Carl Evans and men like him made their own law. Good night, Helen, Jeremy said softly as she headed toward the guest room. Good night, Jeremy. She paused at the doorway, looking back at him. Thank you for today, for everything. Thank you for saying yes. Helen lay in the narrow bed, listening to the sounds of Jeremy moving around the main room, preparing for sleep. The wind continued to howl outside, but the cabin walls were thick and strong, built to withstand whatever the mountains could throw at them. Like Jeremy himself, she thought, solid, dependable, built to last. She thought about the day's events, how quickly her life had changed from despair to hope. This morning she had been Carl Evans' prisoner, resigned to a fate worse than death. Tonight she was Mrs. Jeremy Walker, legally protected and genuinely cherished by a man who asked nothing from her except the chance to earn her trust. It was too much to process all at once, too much change and possibility, and fear all tangled together. But beneath the confusion was a growing certainty that she had made the right choice. Jeremy Walker was a good man, perhaps the first truly good man she had ever known. Whatever the future held, she would face it as his equal partner, not as his property or his burden. Sleep came easier than she had expected, her body finally relaxing in the knowledge that she was safe, that tomorrow would bring new choices and new possibilities instead of the grinding despair that had been her constant companion for so long. But even in sleep, Helen's dreams were troubled by visions of Carl Evans, his cold eyes promising retribution for her escape. She dreamed of chains and darkness, of voices calling her name from places she couldn't reach. She woke several times during the night, heart pounding, until the familiar sounds of Jeremy moving around the cabin reminded her where she was and why she was safe. Morning came with the sound of Jeremy splitting wood outside the cabin, the rhythmic thunk of the axe biting into pine logs, a comforting counterpoint to the whisper of wind through the trees. Helen dressed quickly and emerged from the guest room to find coffee already brewing and bacon sizzling in the pan. Jeremy had been up for hours, she realized, taking care of the morning chores while she slept. "Morning, Mrs. Walker," he said with a smile that made her heart skip. "Morning," Helen replied, still adjusting to the sound of her new name. "You should have woken me. I could have helped with breakfast." "Plenty of time for that," Jeremy said, flipping the bacon with practiced ease. "Besides, I figured you needed the rest after yesterday." Helen poured herself coffee and moved to the window, looking out at the mountain landscape, painted gold and pink by the rising sun. It was beautiful beyond description, this wild country that Jeremy had claimed as his own. She could understand why he had chosen to make his life here, away from the complications and compromises of civilization. "What's the plan for today?" she asked. Jeremy's expression grew serious. "Today we prepare. Carl Evans won't stay away long, and when he comes back, he'll bring more men and bigger guns. We need to be ready." Helen felt her stomach clench with familiar fear. "Maybe I should leave. Find somewhere else to go, somewhere he can't find me." "Running won't solve anything," Jeremy said firmly. "Carl's the type who takes running as an admission of guilt. He'll hunt you down no matter where you go, and next time you might not have any meat to stand with you. But if I stay, you'll be in danger. All those men who helped us yesterday will be in danger." Jeremy turned from the stove, his gray eyes intense. "Helen, those men made their choice the same way you made yours. They're tired of living under Carl's thumb, tired of watching him destroy everything good in these mountains. This fight was coming whether you were here or not." Helen wanted to argue, wanted to insist that she could handle Carl on her own, but the words died in her throat. She had tried to handle Carl alone, and it had ended with her chained in a barn like an animal. The truth was, she needed Jeremy's protection, needed the support of the mountain community that had rallied to her defense. "What do you need me to do?" she asked quietly. Jeremy's smile was proud and grateful. "I need you to learn to shoot." An hour later, Helen stood in the clearing behind the cabin, Jeremy's spare rifle heavy in her hands. The weapon was well maintained but obviously old, the wooden stock worn smooth by countless hands. Jeremy stood behind her, his voice calm and instructional as he explained the basics of marksmanship. "Breathe in, let half of it out, then hold," he said. "Squeeze the trigger slowly, don't jerk it. The rifle should surprise you when it fires." Helen tried to follow his instructions, but her hands were shaking with nervousness. The rifle felt alien in her grip, dangerous and unpredictable. When she finally pulled the trigger, the recoil knocked her backward into Jeremy's chest, and her shot went wide of the target he had set up, a piece of wood with a charcoal X marked on it. "It's all right," Jeremy said patiently. "Try again. This time, lean into the rifle instead of fighting it." They spent the morning practicing, Jeremy's patient instruction gradually helping Helen overcome her fear of the weapon. By noon, she was hitting the target more often than not, though her groups were still scattered and her hands ached from the unfamiliar strain. "You're a natural," Jeremy said as they walked back to the cabin for lunch. "Another few days of practice, and you'll be dangerous." Helen wasn't sure she wanted to be dangerous, but she understood the necessity. Carl Evans was not a man who would be deterred by words or legal documents. When he came for her, and Jeremy was certain he would, violence would be the only language he understood. They ate lunch in companionable silence, both lost in their own thoughts about the confrontation to come. Helen found herself studying Jeremy's face, noting the lines around his eyes that spoke of years spent squinting into mountain sun and wind. He was not a young man, probably in his mid-30s, but there was a vitality to him that made age irrelevant. "Jeremy," she said finally, "why did you really ask me to marry you?" He looked up from his plate, considering the question carefully. "I told you why." "You told me part of it, but there's more, isn't there?" Jeremy set down his fork and leaned back in his chair. "You want the whole truth?" Helen nodded. "The whole truth is that I've been alone for 3 years, and loneliness is a cold companion. When I saw you in that barn, saw your strength and your dignity, even in the worst circumstances, I saw something I thought I'd lost forever." "What?" "Hope," Jeremy said simply. "Hope that life could be more than just surviving from one day to the next. Hope that two people could build something beautiful together, even in this harsh country." Helen felt tears prick at her eyes. "And if I can't give you what you're hoping for, if I can never be more than a friend, a partner in name only." Jeremy reached across the table and took her hand, his touch warm and reassuring. Then I'll have the friendship of a remarkable woman, and that's more than I had yesterday. The sound of approaching horses cut through the afternoon air, and Jeremy was on his feet instantly, his hand moving to the rifle he kept by the door. Helen felt her heart leap into her throat, certain that Carl had returned with reinforcements. But when Jeremy peered through the window, his posture relaxed slightly. It's Mark Ruiz and some of the others. Looks like they've got news. Jeremy opened the door as the riders approached, and Helen counted 5 men, all armed and grim-faced. Mark Ruiz dismounted and approached the cabin, his weathered features creased with concern. Jeremy, Helen, Mark said with a sod, we've got trouble coming. Carl, Jeremy asked. Carl and about 20 men. He rode into town this morning, hired every gun he could find. Word is they're planning to come up here tomorrow morning. Burn you out if they have to. Helen felt the blood drain from her face. 20 men against Jeremy and whatever allies he could muster seemed like impossible odds. 20 men, Jeremy repeated thoughtfully. That's a lot of firepower. Too much, said another of the mountain men, a grizzled veteran named Ryan Baker. We can maybe muster 8 or 10 men, but that's not enough to stand against 20. Depends on where we make our stand, Jeremy said calmly. 20 men are only as good as their ability to use their weapons. Up here in the mountains, numbers don't mean as much as they do on flat ground. Mark nodded slowly. You thinking about the canyon? I'm thinking about it. Jeremy looked at Helen, his expression serious. There's a narrow canyon about 2 miles from here, only one way in or out. If we could draw Carl and his men into it, we could hold them off with a handful of rifles. And if they don't take the bait, Helen asked, then we fight them here and hope for the best. The rest of the afternoon was spent in preparation. Mark and the other mountain men dispersed to gather more allies and ammunition, while Jeremy showed Helen the various defensive positions around the cabin. He had clearly thought about this possibility before, identifying natural cover and clear fields of fire with the eye of a man who understood warfare. You built this place like a fortress, Helen observed, as they checked the cabin's heavy shutters, each one pierced with rifle ports. I built it to last, Jeremy corrected. But yes, I knew there might come a time when I'd have to defend it. As evening approached, the mountain men began returning in small groups. Helen counted 12 men in all, a mix of trappers, homesteaders, and drifters who had found refuge in these wild peaks. They were hard men, weathered by years of struggle and survival, but she could see the respect in their eyes when they looked at Jeremy. All right, Jeremy said as they gathered around the cabin's main room. Here's what we know. Carl's got 20 men, maybe more. They're planning to come up here at first light, probably expecting to catch us sleeping. What's the plan? Asked Tyler Cox. Jeremy moved to the rough map he had drawn on a piece of paper, marking the various trails and landmarks around the cabin. We're going to give them what they want, or at least make them think we are. Helen and I will be here at the cabin, visible and apparently alone. When Carl and his men come up the main trail, we'll retreat toward Devil's Canyon, make it look like we're running scared. And then? Mark asked. Then we spring the trap. Half of you will be positioned on the canyon rim. The other half will circle around behind once Carl's men are committed to the canyon. We'll have them in a crossfire with nowhere to run. It was a good plan, Helen had to admit, though it relied heavily on Carl's arrogance and predictability. If he suspected a trap, if he decided to burn the cabin from a distance instead of pursuing them, the whole strategy would collapse. What about me? Helen asked. What's my role in all this? Jeremy's expression was reluctant but determined. You'll be with me, acting as bait. Carl needs to see you, needs to believe he can still get his hands on you. Otherwise, he might not take the bait. Helen felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. The thought of being used as bait, of deliberately putting herself within Carl's reach, made her stomach clench with fear. But she also understood the necessity. This fight was as much about her as it was about Jeremy or the other mountain men. Carl would never stop hunting her unless he was stopped permanently. I'll do it, she said quietly. Jeremy studied her face, seeing the fear there, but also the determination. You don't have to, Helen. We can find another way. No, Helen said firmly. This is my fight too. I won't hide while other people risk their lives for me. The mountain men spent the night at the cabin, taking turns on watch, while the others tried to get what rest they could. Helen lay in her narrow bed, listening to the quiet conversations and the occasional clink of metal as weapons were cleaned and checked. Tomorrow would bring violence, possibly death, and she found herself wondering if she would live to see another sunset. But alongside the fear was something else, something that surprised her with its intensity. For the first time in her life, she was part of something larger than herself, part of a community that valued her enough to fight for her freedom. These men, most of whom barely knew her, were willing to risk everything simply because it was the right thing to do. Dawn came gray and cold, with low clouds obscuring the mountain peaks. Jeremy woke Helen before first light, his touch gentle but urgent. "It's time," he said quietly. Helen dressed quickly in the clothes Jeremy's wife had worn, practical garments that would allow her to move freely through the rough mountain terrain. Jeremy handed her the rifle she had been practicing with, and she was surprised to find that its weight felt familiar now, comforting rather than alien. The mountain men had already dispersed to their positions, melting into the forest like ghosts. Helen and Jeremy were alone at the cabin, waiting for Carl's arrival with the patience of hunters who understood that timing was everything. They didn't have to wait long. The sound of many horses echoed through the morning air, growing louder as Carl's force approached along the main trail. Helen moved to the window and peered through the shutters, her heart hammering as she saw the column of riders emerging from the tree line. Carl Evans rode at the head of the group, his face set in lines of cold fury. Behind him came 20 men, just as Mark had predicted, a mix of drifters and gunmen, drawn by the promise of easy money. They were well armed and confident, clearly expecting this to be a simple matter of overwhelming force. "Remember," Jeremy said quietly, "we run when I give the signal. Don't look back. Don't hesitate. Just run for the canyon. Everything depends on timing." Helen nodded, her mouth too dry for speech. Through the window, she could see Carl dismounting, his small eyes scanning the cabin for signs of movement. He barked orders to his men, positioning them around the clearing in a loose semicircle. "Walker!" Carl's voice boomed across the clearing. "I know you're in there. Send out the girl, and maybe we can settle this without bloodshed." Jeremy moved to the door, his rifle in his hands. "The girl's name is Helen Walker now, Evans. She's my wife, legally married and under my protection." Carl's laugh was harsh and mocking. "Your wife? That's rich, Walker. You can't marry another man's property." "She was never your property," Jeremy shouted back. "Her father's debts died with him, and you know it. The law says different. I've got papers, Walker, legal papers that say she belongs to me." "Forged papers," Jeremy replied. "And even if they weren't, this is mountain law now, Evans. Up here, a woman belongs to herself and no one else." Carl's face darkened with rage. "Mountain law? I'll show you mountain law." He turned to his men, his voice carrying clearly in the thin air. "Burn them out. I want that girl alive, but Walker can roast for all I care." Several of Carl's men moved toward the cabin with torches, and Jeremy knew it was time to spring their trap. He grabbed Helen's hand and pulled her toward the back door. "Now!" he shouted, and they burst from the cabin, running toward the tree line as fast as their legs could carry them. Behind them, Carl's voice rose in triumph. "There they go! After them, boys! Don't let them get away!" The sound of pursuing horses filled the air as Jeremy and Helen raced through the forest, following the carefully planned route toward Devil's Canyon. Helen's lungs burned with the effort, but she forced herself to keep pace with Jeremy's longer strides, knowing that their lives depended on reaching the canyon before Carl's men could overtake them. The canyon mouth loomed ahead, a narrow gap between towering rock walls that seemed to swallow the morning light. Jeremy and Helen plunged into the shadowy passage, their footsteps echoing off the stone walls as they ran deeper into the trap they had set. Behind them, the thunder of hoofbeats grew louder as Carl's men entered the canyon in pursuit. Helen could hear Carl's voice urging his men forward, promising rewards for her capture and Jeremy's death. The sound of it made her skin crawl, but she forced herself to keep running, to trust in Jeremy's plan and the mountain men positioned on the canyon rim above. "There," Jeremy pointed to a cluster of boulders near the far end of the canyon. "We make our stand there." They scrambled behind the rocks just as the first of Carl's men came into view, their horses picking their way carefully over the rocky canyon floor. Carl himself rode near the front, his face twisted with savage anticipation as he saw his quarry apparently trapped with nowhere to run. "End of the line, Walker," Carl called out, his voice echoing off the canyon walls. "Send out the girl and I might let you live." Jeremy rose from behind the boulder, his rifle trained on Carl's chest. "The only thing I'm sending you, Evans, is a bullet if you don't turn around and ride out of here." Carl's laugh was harsh and confident. "You're outnumbered 20-1, Walker. You can't fight us all." "Maybe not," Jeremy replied calmly, "but I won't be fighting alone." As if summoned by his words, rifle fire erupted from the canyon rim above. The mountain men Jeremy had positioned there opened fire with devastating effect, their shots echoing like thunder in the confined space. Carl's men, caught in the open with nowhere to take cover, began falling from their saddles as the carefully aimed bullets found their marks. "It's a trap!" one of Carl's men screamed, wheeling his horse around in panic. "We're caught in a crossfire!" More shots rang out from behind as the second group of mountain men closed the canyon entrance, cutting off any hope of retreat. Carl's force, which had seemed so overwhelming just moments before, was now trapped in a killing ground with no escape. Carl himself dove from his horse, scrambling for cover behind a fallen log. His face was pale with shock and rage as he realized how completely he had been outmaneuvered. "You bastard, Walker! This is murder!" "This is justice," Jeremy shouted back, his own rifle adding to the deadly chorus. "Justice for every family you've destroyed, every woman you've terrorized." The battle was brief but decisive. Caught between the canyon walls with no cover and no escape, Carl's hired guns began throwing down their weapons and raising their hands in surrender. Those who tried to fight were cut down by the withering crossfire from above. Within minutes, it was over. The canyon floor was littered with bodies and wounded men, the acrid smell of gunpowder hanging heavy in the air. Carl Evans crouched behind his inadequate cover, his small eyes darting frantically as he looked for some way out of the trap that had closed around him. "It's over, Carl," Jeremy called out. "Throw down your gun and surrender." "Go to hell," Carl snarled back, but Helen could hear the fear in his voice now, the desperate bravado of a man who knew his time had come. Jeremy looked at Helen, who was pressed against the boulder beside him, her face pale but determined. "Stay here," he said quietly. "This ends now." "Jeremy, no!" Helen grabbed his arm as he started to rise. "He's dangerous. He might have another gun." "He might," Jeremy agreed, "but I can't let him walk away from this. If he escapes, he'll just come back with more men, more guns. This has to end today." Jeremy stepped out from behind the boulder, his rifle trained on Carl's hiding place. "Last chance, Evans. Surrender now and you live to see trial." Carl's response was a wild shot from his pistol, the bullet whining off the rocks near Jeremy's head. Jeremy didn't flinch, didn't hurry his own shot. He took careful aim and squeezed the trigger, the rifle bucking against his shoulder as the bullet found its mark. Carl Evans pitched forward with a cry of pain and rage, his pistol flying from his nerveless fingers. He clutched at his shoulder, blood seeping between his fingers as he glared up at Jeremy with undimmed hatred. "You've killed me, you bastard," Carl gasped. "No," Jeremy said calmly, walking toward the wounded man, "but I've stopped you. That's all that matters." The mountain men began descending from their positions, their faces grim but satisfied. The threat that had hung over their community for so long was finally ended. The bully who had terrorized them for years brought to justice at last. Helen emerged from behind the boulder, her rifle still in her hands but her finger off the trigger. She looked down at Carl Evans, this man who had held such power over her life, and felt only pity for the pathetic figure he had become. "It's over," she said quietly, and Jeremy heard the wonder in her voice, as if she could hardly believe it was true. "It's over," Jeremy agreed, putting his arm around her shoulders. "You're free, Helen, truly free." As the mountain men began the grim task of tending to the wounded and gathering up the survivors, Helen and Jeremy walked back through the canyon toward their home. The morning sun had burned away the clouds, revealing the snow-covered peaks in all their majesty. It was a beautiful day, Helen realized, perhaps the most beautiful day of her life. "What happens now?" she asked as they walked. "Now we build the life we talked about," Jeremy replied. "We plant that garden, raise some children if you want them, and grow old together in this place we've fought to defend." Helen looked up at him, this man who had saved her life and offered her freedom, and felt her heart swell with an emotion she was only beginning to recognize. It might not be love yet, but it was something precious and growing, something worth nurturing and protecting. "I'd like that," she said softly. "I'd like that very much." They reached the cabin to find it undamaged, Carl's men having been too eager in their pursuit to carry out their threat to burn it down. The mountain men dispersed to their own homes, their duty done, and their community safe once again. Helen and Jeremy were left alone with their future, two people who had found each other in the darkest of circumstances and chosen to build something beautiful together. That evening, as they sat by the fire and talked about their plans for the spring planting, Helen realized that she had never been happier. She was free, truly free for the first time in her life, free to choose her own path, to discover her own heart, to become the woman she was meant to be. And she was not alone. Beside her sat a man who valued her for herself, who had fought for her freedom and asked for nothing in return except the chance to earn her love. It was more than she had ever dared to dream, more than she had thought possible in a world that had shown her so little kindness. The future stretched before them like an uncharted territory, full of possibilities and promise. There would be challenges, certainly, hardships to overcome, and obstacles to face. But they would face them together, as equal partners in the life they were building. Helen Walker, formerly Helen White, looked into the fire and smiled. She had found her place at last, her purpose and her peace. She belonged to no one but herself, and she had chosen to share that self with a man worthy of the gift. Outside, the mountain winds sang through the trees, carrying with it the promise of spring and new beginnings. Inside the cabin, two people sat together in comfortable silence, planning their tomorrow and all the tomorrows that would follow. It was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything.